Welcome to Sunspots, where we explore the many ways that the Holy Spirit is working in the people, places, ministries, and missions on the surface of the sun. That is, the Synod of the Sun. I'm Thomas Riggs, Communication and Administration Coordinator. Our prayer is that you find inspiration, community, and connection in the Sun. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to the second episode featuring disaster partnership conversations on the Synod of the Sun's podcast, Sunspots. I am recording this episode today from New Orleans, Louisiana, where I live. And according to my phone, it is currently 95 degrees, but with the lovely 58% humidity, it feels more like 105 degrees. And if you live in the Synod of the Sun, you might know a little bit about what I'm talking about today. It is hot out there. And today we're going to talk about how one of our congregations has opened their doors as a cooling station to provide relief to their neighbors and community. So I am delighted to have this conversation today with the Reverend Oliva Lane, pastor and head of staff of Southminster Presbyterian Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on today.
So how hot is it where you are today? I saw you pull up your phone.
Yes, so it is currently 100 degrees here in Tulsa, and we are in the midst of an excessive heat warning. And that was yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I think it's supposed to get up to about 104 by 5 p.m. today.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you're here because we're not only going to talk about the cooling station that you are serving, but you have had a weather event in your area. But before we dive into that, I'd love to just introduce people to who you are. And you must be a very humble person because there's no bio of you on your church's website. So what would you like for us to know about you? How have you come to find yourself in ministry at Southminster?
Sure, I would love to share a little bit about that. One thing I will say about this wonderful community and congregation is that they are a very sort of justice and neighborhood oriented community. They do lots and lots of things for the city of Tulsa. They support over 22 nonprofits here in Tulsa, including starting several of those nonprofits. And they do it all without much acclaim, which is something that I really resonate with. Just the idea of putting your actions about what you believe at the forefront of how you do things and letting other people figure out eventually that that's who's doing it. So I think probably I match up a lot with the way that this church is oriented. And so it's a very natural fit. I grew up here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I did not grow up in the Presbyterian Church, but I came to the Presbyterian Church when I was in college. And I actually went to the University of Tulsa, which is historically a Presbyterian school. And while I was there, I learned a lot about the Reformed tradition. I was a Presbyterian Leaders and Scholars and did a heritage tour in Scotland. And I also sang as a scholarship singer for First Presbyterian Church downtown in downtown Tulsa. And so that was sort of my introduction to Reformed theology and worship, and I loved it. I really resonated with the way that the tradition understood sort of the head and the heart connection. And I loved the education that was required for people to do deep work. And also the way that that was put into practice was, for me, I had a lot of integrity and resonated with a lot of the things that I cared about. And so I actually went to seminary, went to Princeton Theological Seminary right out of undergraduate, and I got my Master's of Divinity. And then I went to Durham, North Carolina. And when I left seminary, I didn't really see that I would ever be a pastor. I sort of had this idea that I could stay in my own comfortable space. I worked as a chaplain for many years, first as a neuroscience and psychiatric hospital chaplain when I lived in North Carolina. And then as a university chaplain for Georgetown University, I was their chaplain for spiritual formation for about 4 years. And I loved chaplaincy work, and I loved working with different demographics. And also, when I was at Georgetown, I ended up pastoring the Protestant church at Georgetown. And that was really sort of a shift for me in my own sense of call. I never viewed myself as a pastoral figure. I grew up in a community that had no women in ministry, so I didn't really see myself doing that. And then through this whole process of chaplaincy and then being called to this community, I really had a great joy that was born in me in the process of pastoring a community. And after I left Georgetown, I have 2 young children and a spouse. And after about 4 years, I thought it is really hard to raise children on a very large college campus, and I need a little more sustainable lifestyle. So we moved back to Oklahoma, and I still thought like maybe I can get away with being a spiritual director for the rest of my life. I'm a Ignatian certified spiritual director, but in the sort of process of moving back to Oklahoma, I really missed parish life and community life. And so I actually received a call at Southminster just about a year and a half after moving back. And it was really the right fit and the right call for our family too. I really wanted to raise my children in a community sort of neighborhood style church. And so this has been a really joyful, I think, meeting and fit for all of us. And I've been now at Southminster for almost 3 years. So.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. That really tells us a lot about your heart matching up with the congregation's heart for service and community. And I imagine that being from the area is this wonderful added value that you bring to the congregation as well, as someone who recently moved back to my hometown.
Yes,
I have that same feeling. Okay, so we're here to talk about the storm that happened on, I believe, June 17th, so a little over a week and a half ago. And it wasn't it's not a named tornado, it's not a named anything, but it was a pretty intense storm with winds up to, I believe, like 125 miles per hour in Tulsa. So tell us about what that storm was like for you, because it was middle of the night. So what was that like? And then how did you?
Absolutely. So I don't know about how everyone else in the city of Tulsa was preparing for this, because to be honest, and several people I've spoken to were in the same situation. The first indication I had that there was even a storm that was going to happen was we get text alerts on our phone. So it's this loud, blaring alarm. And I picked it up. It was about 11:30 at night. We had some friends that had just come in to visit us from DC. So they were staying in our guest apartment. And, my kids were in bed asleep and my spouse was wrapping up for the evening. And I get this text and it says, straight line winds headed your way, extreme warning, death likely if people are outside. So please take shelter immediately. And I'm like, wait, what? How is this even possible? Because, it was definitely a balmy night. And when I was in high school, I grew up in Oklahoma, I did storm chasing. It's what we do. And I'm very familiar with weather patterns and with tornadoes. And I was like, straight line winds, that's not something that hits Tulsa. So I walked outside because I thought in Oklahoma, we check for ourselves. I walked outside to take a peek and there was lightning that was happening. And the first thing I noticed was that the lightning was almost this aquamarine color. It was a very unusual color, aquamarine to almost like a lime green. And I immediately, when it lit up the sky, I thought, oh, the sky is not good. So we actually went ahead and woke up our friends and got their 6-month-old and their 8-year-old and their dog and took our kids and we all went down. We live in an old house in the Midtown area of Tulsa, which is one of the areas that was hit the hardest. And so we took everyone and we said, maybe we're overreacting. Normally Tulsans don't go into their basement for any reason, because historically tornadoes that come toward the city, they follow this route down I-44. They go up because the city's in a bit of a depression. So the weather patterns and the wind often causes the tornadoes to go up over the city and come down on the other side. But I said, this is a little different than what we've experienced. So let's go to the basement. So we went to the basement and within about 20 minutes, so our tornado sirens did start going off. You could, within about 20 minutes of getting the alert, you could just hear a wall of sound, which is the wind itself. And right down the street from us, they recorded the 110 to 120 mile an hour winds. but we really didn't know, how long this would take, what it was going to happen. There's babies and little kids and a dog in the basement. We're just sort of waiting, hoping that the kids will sleep through it. And I did at one point, after the wind settled down a little bit, I went upstairs to sort of look out our window, and I could see right away that there was significant damage in our neighborhood. And as I was watching, the transformer across the street from our house got hit by lightning. And I was like, oh dear. So our electricity went out at that point. And then shortly thereafter, the electricity came back on, maybe for about 20 seconds. And then I watched as our neighbor's enormous old tree literally just fell over and hit the transformer, and the transformer exploded into flames, which thankfully went out very quickly because the rain was very driving at that point. But as soon as that happened, I looked at my husband, I said, we're not going to have power for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we realized at that point, like, there's going to be a lot of destruction, and there's really nothing else we can do about it tonight. It was almost 1 o'clock at that point. And so we told our friends, like, let's everyone just go to sleep, and we're going to deal with what we have to deal with in the morning. So that was Saturday night. And, as the spouse of a pastor, that Saturday night preparation is often, pre-service sorts of things. And so I woke up at about 5 a.m. and immediately went down to the church because I just had no idea what I was going to see, what we were going to face. In our yard, we had some massive limbs that were down, blocking some of our windows. And I just thought, I don't know what I'm going to find. I need to go see what condition the church is in. And then I need to start checking in on people. Right. And I live literally 3 minutes from my church. And that's intentional. So that, if I need to get here quickly, I can, or if I need to run home and put kids to bed, I can. Yeah. So it literally takes me 3 minutes to get from my doorstep to the front of the church. And I had to go so many different ways to try and get to church. There was a water main that was broken.
So you're trying to drive to
multiple streets are blocked by just enormous downed trees. There are downed power lines exposed on the road everywhere. So obviously don't want to drive over those. It took me a solid, almost 15 minutes to get to the church. And I just kept on having to weave around and try and find different ways to go. And as I started driving a little bit more, I realized, oh my goodness, this is really, really widespread. It wasn't just with tornadoes, there's often a pretty distinct path that it follows. And so your destruction's very narrow. This was so different because it was everything. And I mean, for example, the neighbor that is 3 houses down from us lost his house literally through a tree, going through the center of his house through both stories. But, that was, I think we have maybe 986 or 987 houses that have that kind of significant damage to them. So it's more than just what we would normally see from that kind of storm. When I got down to the church, though, the church had power. None of the neighborhood around the church had power. All the stoplights were out. But the church and this little coffee shop that I go to all the time on the corner both had power. And I realized pretty much instantaneously, we have power resources. I'm going to need to utilize those because I can already tell that there are a lot of people that don't. And this is Tulsa, Oklahoma in June. So it's hot here. And the reality of disasters is that the most vulnerable are so at such high risk of complications after the disaster has actually passed. So the storm itself, while that can, cause a lot of damage and sometimes even loss of life, it's really the complications that arise after the storm from broken infrastructure and lack of access to medical supplies and that sort of thing. That's where we really see issues in the community. So my first thought was the church appears to be okay. We had a little bit of water damage from a roof that leaked. And an area where some of the fascia was torn off from the winds, but we are in a very urban area surrounded by lots of concrete. And so this is the first time I've ever been glad that we didn't have trees all around the church.
Yeah.
And just what I was able to say, okay, this is minor damage. The church is still operational. What can we do to try and use this as a resource right away? The other thing that happened was that pretty much immediately the following morning, we had no cell service in Tulsa. Nobody had cell service. Internet was we didn't have internet at the church. So I also thought, oh my goodness, I have the most tenacious group of Presbyterians because they're Presbyterians. And I thought they are all going to try and come down here and go to church. And, there are downed power lines everywhere. There were crews that were like, please don't leave your homes because we have some really serious things we're trying to clean up. And we don't want additional accidents. And one of the things that we saw in the days after the storm was that there were a lot of accidents at four-way stops where there were, lights out and things. There were so many collisions just because people aren't used to driving under those conditions. And so my first thought was, how do I let the congregation know, like, please don't come to church this morning, help your neighbors, do what you need to do in your immediate vicinity, but it's not a good idea for us to gather because it's really going to inhibit, particularly the area that our church is a heavily trafficked shopping area. And the last thing that they needed while they're trying to clean this up is more people trying to come down here and come into the neighborhood. So that's what it looked like for us.
That's a lot. You've been through a lot. And how did you communicate that out? Was that through email, Facebook? What was that like?
So we couldn't send any emails. The only thing I could do was update through Facebook. Luckily, we have a pretty active congregation on social media, which, I mean, that honestly was so lucky because you think about how we communicate things when technology is down, and it is tricky. I did also go ahead and just drive around to a couple members who I knew were extra vulnerable to check on them and make sure that, they were physically okay, because I knew that they would have no way to communicate with me via cell phone or anything like that. So the primary thing that we did was put out a Facebook message, which somehow we were able to access Facebook. And then I also put up physical signs on the church
around the building,
just to let people know, the building is open and has power, but we're not gathering for worship today. So
we've got other plans today. So
I said, help your neighbors.
Pray on the streets, pray out there. And so tell me, how did you guys get connected? Because it was a Red Cross official cooling station. How did that connection happen? And what was entailed in the commitment to be a cooling station?
So our congregation has had a relationship with the Red Cross for a long time. We've had a lot of blood drives. They'll bring out the truck and all sorts of things. So there was already a pre-existing awareness, I think, of the church and its resources. Another thing is that when this happened, a lot of the places that we use in Tulsa as cooling stations did not have power. So we were already working with a lot fewer resources than we would normally have. And I had posted something on Facebook almost immediately just saying, hey, the church is a resource. We're available if people need it. Here's this information. And someone on Facebook saw that and gave my information to one of the site coordinators for the Red Cross, because the Red Cross's site here in Tulsa had significant damage. They lost a roof and had a lot of flooding on their upper floor. So they were also trying very quickly to get people out of their areas and into other safe places. So I got a phone call actually on Monday morning from one of their coordinators, and they said, is there any way that you guys would consider letting us host a disaster relief site at your church? And I thought it was really interesting how they approached that question, because it was almost like, we're really sorry to have to ask you this question, but we have great need, and so we have to ask it. And I was like, obviously you have great need. And also we have resources. So of course we would love to be able to offer those to you. But it did make me in subsequent conversations realize how much negotiating they have to do with spaces to be able to use them, because people have real concerns about are they going to damage our property? Are they going to bring in people that are going to disrespect our spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really interesting, I think, for them also to work with me as a community leader and with this congregation, which is just a naturally very generous hearted community. They kept on saying, your people are so kind. They're so helpful. And I was like, yeah, it's sort of our faith in action that we've been working on. But no, it was that phone call, and then they sent out a site coordinator to do a walkthrough. And part of what they were asking from us was not just to be a cooling station. There were several places around town that were able to provide cooling, but they actually needed overnight shelter.
Oh, wow.
Because a number of people couldn't stay in their apartments overnight. And because we have on-site showers and lockers and a very, very large gymnasium that's connected to a large fellowship hall, they came and they said, this would be the ideal setup for us. So if you guys would let us use your spaces, we will bring in cots and blankets, and we will staff it 24/7. We will do 3 meals a day that we actually bring in and cater. We do have a catering kitchen, but they actually bring in everything pre-catered. And then they said snacks and water. If we can use your space and your electricity and your water, and your ice machine, then that would be fantastic. And we had already sort of cleaned out our community spaces. I was running around on Sunday making sure that all of our toilets were functioning, all the things that, they teach you in seminary about
how to say, like, pastors, check out the toilets.
How to care for spaces. No, it's great. But I had already made sure that we were ready to go when they came and did their walkthrough, and they said, if this is okay, you sign this document. We have a building use agreement. So we had them sign our building use agreement, made sure that our expectations about the spaces that were going to be used were clear. So we said, these are the spaces we canceled. We normally have a lot of groups that use our community center. And so I spent most of the day Monday calling all those groups and saying, whatever else happens, I'm sorry if you don't have power yet, and you are welcome to utilize these spaces for disaster relief, but there will be no pickleball in the gym on
that's another episode, pickleball in the gym. I'm going to bookmark that one.
I was going to say my precious pickleball players, for the most part, are extremely understanding, but they were very disappointed not to have access to their pickleball for a week. But basically, the Red Cross brought in a large trailer and all of the different resources. They had an on-site nurse. We had several people that needed help that had respiration issues, that were suffering from heat exhaustion. So that was really great to have that resource on site, and to be able to check up on people. And then they also coordinated transportation to our location if people needed to be picked up from somewhere. We had several people that had significant mobility issues and needed rides, or one gentleman that was stuck on the 4th floor of his apartment building because he was not able to get down the stairs. And so they literally went and carried him down the stairs so that he could come to the cooling center. So those kind of resources, I think, are so important and helpful because, our congregation's 215-ish people, and the volunteer effort that it takes to do all of that is just, it's massive. And so I was so grateful to have that partnership. Originally, when they called me, they said, we have some emergency stuff in place. Can we use the church facility starting on Thursday? And I said, oh yeah, sure. This is Monday, mind you. And then they called me that evening and they said, okay, some stuff has changed. It's possible that we might need to use the church. And I could tell that she didn't want to say what she was going to say. And I said, do you need to use the church tomorrow? And she said, yeah, we do. We do need to use the church tomorrow. So they actually got it in set up on Tuesday and had the shelter operational by Tuesday. And we had people staying in there overnight Tuesday night. So yeah.
Well, there's so much. There's so much I want to unpack, but I also want to move forward. But just reflecting back, having, been a pastor, of a church, serving a community in need, having been, in a in a city that sees disasters often, there's a couple of things. One that I just want to highlight for those. I think the people who listen to this are interested in how can their church be better prepared and more responsive in times of disaster. It's a very niche audience we have, and I'm grateful for them. But one thing is that you were aware of the vulnerable members of the church. I have this like 12-step church disaster plan on our website. And that I believe is step number 3 is to update your member directory and then to know which ones are the ones who may have mobility issues. Like you said, which ones don't have cell phones, who are still using their landlines. And when the landlines are down, how do they get in touch with people? Those who, especially now that, we've been through COVID, those who have, more medical, vulnerabilities if they're on oxygen tanks and things like that. And so I think that's an important thing about your ministry, that you knew which members to check in on first. And the other, having a building use plan in place, it's like, hooray, nobody, I'm sure nobody on a session or on a property committee like dreams of the day that they're serving Jesus Christ by working on their manual of operations.
Absolutely.
But this is part of it.
It's exactly why.
But this is what allows you, like, we were discussing about that institutional flexibility. Is like when you've got this stuff in place, this is why preparedness is so important, is when you take the time to do the grunt work ahead of time. In the moment, you have the capacity. Your capacity is increased tenfold to be flexible, to be open, to be responsive, and to be available when other resources are so scarce. So those are just some things that I've recognized that I just want to celebrate your congregation's work in doing that. And so now moving forward, so what are things like now? It's like 12 days, 10 days after. How are things? What continued needs are there? And for those who are listening, are there ways that their congregations can support? What are the needs?
So I am really privileged to work with a group here in Tulsa called Action Tulsa, which is a whole network of congregations of nonprofits that try to mobilize to do different things for the city. And we have actually been in pretty close conversation coming out of this about the ongoing needs, because there are so many ongoing needs and they look really different for different populations. I was really grateful with our response immediately to be able to address some of the biggest vulnerabilities that we knew about, people who didn't have medication that needed to be refrigerated, et cetera, like some of those things that you're able to do. But one of the things that may not occur to most people, but has been hugely impactful from this storm, is that a lot of people lost all of their food. And without refrigeration. So my own family, we didn't have power from Saturday night until Thursday night. And we didn't have a generator. And like most people, we lost all the food in our refrigerator. Now I have a job, I can replace that food, but we have a pretty significant housing crisis that was already going on in Tulsa. And the population that is most affected by that doesn't have money to just go out and replace all their groceries. We had a college student in our community, in our congregation, who he had just bought groceries and he lost all of them. And he's like, I only buy groceries every 3 weeks. I can't afford to go back out and buy more groceries. I'm just going to have to wait for the next 2.5 weeks until I can afford to go buy groceries again. And that's just a minor example. But one of the things that we recognize is that a lot of people, even if they didn't experience the storm damage, they lost work. Most people didn't have internet capacity for almost a week. A lot of people work remotely in Tulsa. They lost work, they lost food. And some people really did lose their housing. And so we already had a crunch on our housing that was a pretty significant concern. And that's an even greater concern going forward. So I actually spent some time on Tuesday talking with a Senate Majority Leader here in Oklahoma, asking what kind of disaster assistance we have that can come to us as a state. It took, 3 days for us to be declared a state of disaster because of things going on at the state level. And that really affects people who are the most vulnerable because they don't have a safety net in place, and 3 days is a long time. The other piece of that is that they're not sure yet, because of the way that the storm happened and the communities that it affected, if we qualify for federal aid, because we don't know if we have enough destroyed homes, right, to get federal aid. When I'm thinking about this, and I'm like, well, people still lost all this food, and they lost work, and there are still people that are really vulnerable that are extremely affected by this. And we don't know yet, a week and a half later, whether or not we have any resources to offer them. So one of the things that we talked about with the senator, and one of the things that we're working on as a church community, is getting gift cards, grocery gift cards, to be able to give to people who need to replace just like basic food items. And a lot of it is like basic fresh food. So people having access to, milk and eggs and things like that.
Vegetables.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Food Bank of Oklahoma has done a really good job of putting together some canned goods, but that's all that they can put together right now. And so that's one of the things that we've been trying to figure out too, is like, how do we get people some fresh groceries that don't have, access to that? I would say that that's probably one of the biggest things that we're working on. And then, goodness, the vulnerability issues coming out of this for me are they're really kind of astounding, particularly with our older community or older populations. I think we all know coming out of COVID that there is a lot of loneliness and there is a lot of disconnect. And if you don't belong to a church community, a lot of people don't have a third place that knows them and is aware of their needs and can check in on them. And without relationship, it's hard to access the resources that we do have. So we had some congregants who knew that their neighbor across the street from them was vulnerable, knew that they had mobility issues and could not get in and out of their house because their garage door could not be raised. So they can't get down steps, and they only had steps going in and out of their house. And so they were essentially trapped in a very, very hot house. And my congregants knew this. And so they went over and they convinced this person to go with them to the shelter, helped find a way to get them out and move them. But that is because they had a relationship with that person who would not have otherwise gone with someone else. And it makes us realize how much need there is just for some simple relational ways of being and some relationship building in this city, because we do have people that are very isolated. So
that's a lot.
I would say food and relationships. That's where we are. It's very church oriented.
Well, yeah, I was like, as a New Orleanian, and I think like Southerners in general, like, like, aren't we all about food and relationship and sharing what you have with your neighbor, like bringing your casserole over. And, but you named a lot of the inequities involved. Inequities are exacerbated when disasters happen, right? And even, talking about the hesitancy of the uncertainty of whether it will even become a federally declared disaster is part of the inequity problem, because I'm a Katrina child, and FEMA then was very heavily dependent on home ownership, right? It's helping the homeowners rebound, and it totally discounts those who are not homeowners, who are renters or living with other people, multiple households in one home. And so those are a lot of the sort of very, very nuanced inequities that often are invisible in times of disasters. And especially because even the counts are like how many homes are damaged. And not how many people are hungry. Not
how many, individuals or families.
And that's really, and something I think and now that I'm in the sort of disaster world, I see the conversations. There's a lot of conversations and needing input. And I hope that if people are in those circles, that they raise those concerns. It takes us who have the privilege and power and voice to raise those concerns on behalf of those who are not around the table, who do not get to say that, like, well, what about the way that the disaster impacted me, even though I don't have a home that was damaged in the storm? It does impact me. And what are the resources in place for someone like me? Like that conversation is still like a very minuscule part of the disaster recovery world.
I would say one thing that we were already pursuing here at Southminster, and I think is so important just to raising awareness of the issues that are going on in the community that may not be your immediate community. We're hosting a tenants union, basically a group of, we don't have a lot of favorable laws in Oklahoma for tenants. And that is part of our housing crisis that we're currently experiencing, and the tenants were not organized. And by hosting, a tenants gathering and organizing the tenants here at the church, we can hear firsthand those impact stories and learn, what the real crises are and how these are profoundly affecting people's ability to just have their basic needs met. And that's been really eye-opening, I think, for us as a community. We're like most Presbyterian churches. We have a lovely building. We have, a stable population. And I think a real desire to serve our city. That's really hard to do when you don't have relationships in a broad, array of the actual city, if you're just confined to your little safe bubble. And so, learning about these stories that tenants are experiencing and the gross inequities that are happening with landlords and tenants in our own city has been really helpful as we think about, okay, if we want to address the systemic issue of housing, right? Okay, we have to understand what the issues are and what people are actually facing. And, there, for example, a tenant that we know lost their apartment building, but it wasn't worth it to the landlord. I mean, they're not going to have a place to go after this. The landlord doesn't want to fix the building. It's not worth it to them. They weren't maintaining it well anyway. And so, what do you do when all of a sudden you're homeless? And who do you go to for support and when we're already experiencing housing issues? So,
Yeah, well, it sounds like you guys are really paying attention to the important issues. And I hope this experience, not that I want every church to go through what you guys have been through, like that is not my desire at all. But I came into the Presbyterian Church because I witnessed the Presbyterian Church being a part of people's actual healing and recovery. That is what helped me see, like we talked about, faith in action. It's like, well, if I see this in my life, I want to be a part of this. And I hope that other churches can be inspired and learn from your congregation of what that faith in action looks like, that there's no shortage of opportunities to be present. And there's no shortage of disasters, honestly. My work is around these weather events. We want to call them natural, but they're not actually natural because it's based off of climate change and based off of all these other things. Our
poor stewardship of the resources of the earth.
So it's not really natural disasters anymore. It's more and more becoming
consequences.
It's consequences. Yes. And so this is a part of our, like you said, stewardship. It really is. And I think of, disaster work is not, when something happens, I often call around and, I hear our church is fine. And that's the end of the email. And so I hope that everybody hears, it's like, it's not just, is your church fine? It's, how are the people around your church? How are the people around your church members? And where is hope and healing needed at this moment? And how can we be a part of ushering that into the world? And I hope that, I sense that you guys have been a part of that. And I hope other people continue to join all of us in doing that.
Absolutely. Well, you make an excellent point. I mean, natural disasters, or natural consequences, as I like to call them, there are a great equalizer in many ways. And so it's interesting because we had people from the congregation and people from the community both utilizing the shelter at the same time, which in church mission work, that doesn't normally happen, right? A lot of times you feel like, okay, we're providing the resources or we're supplying, this thing for this need. But when you're all on the same page and everybody is like, okay, this is hard and we're suffering and this is challenging, and how can we come together as a community and really love our neighbors and not just, give things to our neighbors so that they'll leave us alone.
or our guilt is, assuaged and we're
assuaged.
done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think it really does some wonderful things for the moral imagination to say like, okay, these really are our neighbors, and we really do, our interests are entirely bound up in one another. Mm-hmm. And so when you suffer in my neighborhood, whether I see it or not, you're suffering. And now that I know, I have a responsibility because of my faith to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been a really meaningful thing for our community to say, we see that our neighbors are suffering and we have a responsibility to do something about it. Mm. So.
Well, Olivia, I've taken up a lot of your time because you've been going nonstop, I'm sure, and over the last 2 weeks. But I do want to highlight that just a couple of things for people to know, as my program, the Synod Partnership for Disaster Recovery, it's new to the Synod. It's the only of its kind in the PCUSA, and it's in partnership with Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, PDA, which I saw on the website is an organization within the PCUSA that your church has already had a relationship and history with. And I'm sure that has had an influence on your capacity and the ways that your eyes were already open to the needs in your community. And I know that the presbyteries received a grant. We hope and pray those grant monies come to you and support the efforts that you're doing. And I'll put information on our website with how to donate gift cards. We'll talk offline if you guys are in the capacity to receive funding, or we could do it through Presbytery. We'll figure it out, and we'll point people on ways that they can support you. Any last words, Olivia, on anything you want to say in terms of if congregations and people who are listening, are thinking about their churches and their resources, what's like a simple beginning? What's the next step that people can take to help shape the culture of their organization, the culture of their congregation, so that they are community minded and find ways to be open even in the midst of a disaster?
So for me, this has everything to do with spiritual formation. And I mean, it does, because if your interior is oriented toward this kind of care, then it happens on the exterior. Our congregation is a Matthew 25 congregation. That's been really important for us in the way that we think about our neighbors and loving and serving our neighbors and staying energized for the long-term work that we do. So I would say if you haven't explored that initiative, it's a wonderful initiative to explore. The other thing would be to, have a really honest conversation with your session. If this is something that you care about, that you want to be able to be mobilized for, I understand if you don't have enough capacity, not starting a new thing. But if this is something that you feel energized for, make sure that your leadership is on board, and then let them do this kind of work in the community with the rest of the congregation, talking about, take an inventory of your resources and your building, figure out if you need to have a generator on site in case of a disaster. Those of us who live in areas that do get hit more frequently with these natural consequences, it is good to be prepared, because it's just a matter of time before something happens. And there are so many creative ways for the church to respond in these situations. I would say, don't imagine that just because your mission or ministry doesn't look the same as another congregation, that it is not vital to your community. Use your creative imagination, whether it's opening your parking lot so that people can, park their cars there and be safe at night if they have to stay in their car, whatever it is. I think we have so many more resources than we recognize. We have an abundance of resources in the PCUSA, and be creative about how you share those with others.
Amen. I could not agree more. You're just preaching. You're preaching the word.
So-
So, well, and I didn't want to assume earlier the Matthew 25 connection,
Yeah.
because you just never know. But I'm glad to hear that that's a part of your congregation's, you know, focus around their ministry, and that I can see that reflected in the focus on more systemic issues, right? What is the larger picture? What are the root causes of poverty? And I could see the Matthew 25 stuff there, but I didn't want to assume. So that's good to hear. Well, I want us to just let people know that if your church needs church disaster preparedness plans, we have those on our website, synodsun.org. And I'm your resource. My name is Kathy Lee-Cornell, Director of the Synod Partnership for Disaster Recovery. I'm here to talk to you in your congregation so you do not have to do this alone. Well, thank you, Olivia. And I just want to send us out with this blessing today, that as you go about the rest of your day, may the mercy and compassion of God protect you always. May the Spirit of God calm the waves and storms of this world until all of creation are free to dwell together in peace. Amen.
Amen. Kathy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the Synod of the Sun, we believe when we work together across boundaries, we make visible the good news, and we find wholeness as the body of Christ. In our common calling, we impact lives together. So let's remember to connect with, equip, and empower one another in the name of Jesus Christ, today and every day.